He invited everyone to witness his new beginning, never expecting his past to walk in quietly behind him. Crystal chandeliers glowed above the ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, their light scattering across polished marble floors and tailored suits. The air filled with soft jazz and the gentle clink of champagne glasses as Daniel Carter stood near the center of the room. One hand wrapped confidently around Olivia's waist, his posture relaxed, his smile polished, the kind built for cameras and admiration. And when he lifted his glass, conversations softened naturally, as if the room already understood he expected attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight," he said smoothly, his voice warm, measured, practiced. "I wanted to celebrate not just new partnerships, but a new chapter in my life." Olivia leaned closer, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she smiled toward the crowd, and Daniel pulled her slightly forward, pride clear in his expression. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Olivia Carter." Applause followed, polite at first, then warmer as guests nodded, some stepping forward to greet them, while servers moved quietly with silver trays. And near the tall entrance doors, a woman stepped inside without announcement, her black dress simple but perfectly fitted, her heels quiet against marble, her posture calm, almost distant, as if she had stepped into the wrong room, yet belonged more than anyone there. She paused briefly, letting her eyes adjust to the golden light, then walked slowly along the edge of the room. Unnoticed, her hands relaxed at her sides, her expression composed, and across the room, an older investor with silver hair lifted his glass, then froze, his brows tightening slightly as he leaned forward, studying her face, recognition forming slowly, like a memory resurfacing after years, his voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor Hayes?" The words traveled quietly, not loud enough to command attention, yet enough for the woman beside him to turn. Then another guest followed her gaze. Conversations softened, one by one, like a ripple. Moving across still water, Daniel continued smiling, unaware, as Olivia greeted a board member, but the atmosphere shifted subtly. A few guests stopped mid-conversation, someone lowered their glass, another turned completely toward the entrance, and Eleanor Hayes continued walking calmly, her steps measured, her gaze steady, as if she felt the change without acknowledging it. And then, from deeper within the crowd, a tall man in a navy suit turned fully toward her, his expression composed yet attentive, and when he began moving toward her, several guests instinctively stepped aside, recognizing him immediately. Alexander Whitmore moved with quiet authority, his presence alone enough to draw attention, and Daniel finally noticed the subtle shift, his smile faltering slightly as he followed the direction of everyone's eyes, confusion crossing his face as he searched for the reason. And then he saw her, standing calmly beneath the chandelier light, unchanged yet somehow stronger, and for a brief second, Daniel Carter forgot what he had been saying, because the room had already begun to remember her name. Daniel Carter felt the attention shifting before he understood why, the applause fading into scattered murmurs as guests who had been smiling at him now turned subtly toward the entrance, their expressions changing from polite interest to quiet recognition. And Eleanor Hayes continued forward without hesitation, her heels echoing softly against marble, her black dress understated but elegant, the kind that did not ask for attention yet somehow gathered it. And Olivia noticed first, her smile tightening slightly as she followed the direction of the room, her eyes scanning until they settled on Eleanor, and there was a flicker of confusion, then curiosity, as if she sensed something she could not yet define, while Daniel narrowed his gaze, studying the familiar outline of a face he had not seen in years, disbelief forming slowly, because Eleanor looked different, not in appearance alone, but in presence. The nervous softness he once knew replaced by calm composure, the kind that did not need to announce itself. And nearby, the silver-haired investor straightened his posture, lowering his glass as he continued watching her. Then he nodded slightly to another guest beside him, whispering again, this time more certain, "That is Eleanor Hayes." And the second guest responded with quiet surprise, their voices barely audible, yet the reaction spread, like a subtle current moving across the room, and Daniel finally stepped slightly forward, his expression shifting from confusion to guarded recognition, because now he was certain, and memories surfaced quickly. A small apartment with morning sunlight, Eleanor working late at the dining table, her quiet encouragement when his business struggled, her calm voice when he doubted himself, and then the final memory, the signed divorce papers resting between them, her steady hands as she pushed them forward without argument, without tears, just quiet acceptance, and the contrast unsettled him now, because the woman walking toward the center of the ballroom looked nothing like the one he left behind, and Olivia adjusted her posture, her hand tightening gently around Daniel's arm, sensing the shift in his attention. "Do you know her?" she asked softly, and Daniel hesitated, his voice lower than before. "Yes, I used to." And Eleanor slowed near a passing server, accepting a glass of sparkling water instead of champagne, her fingers steady, her expression neutral, as if she were simply attending another formal evening, not walking into a room filled with her past, and several guests who had once overlooked her now watched carefully, their eyes measuring, recognizing something more. And then Alexander Whitmore turned fully from across the room, his gaze settling on Eleanor with unmistakable recognition, and as he began moving toward her, conversations quieted further, because when Alexander Whitmore moved, people noticed, and Daniel followed the movement instinctively, confusion deepening, while Eleanor lifted her eyes and met Alexander halfway, calm and composed, as if this moment had been expected all along. Alexander Whitmore stopped a few feet in front of Eleanor Hayes, and the subtle shift in the room became undeniable, because when he paused, others instinctively followed, conversations dissolving into quiet observation, and Eleanor met his gaze with calm familiarity, her expression steady, neither surprised nor overly warm, as if this meeting had already happened many times before, and Alexander inclined his head slightly, a gesture small yet filled with quiet respect. "Eleanor," he said, his voice calm and measured, and several guests nearby exchanged quick glances, because Alexander Whitmore rarely addressed anyone so personally in public, and Eleanor responded with a soft nod. "Alexander," her tone composed, effortless, and Daniel felt the air tighten in his chest as he watched, confusion deepening into something more uncomfortable, because he had spent years trying to enter circles where Alexander Whitmore moved naturally. Yet now the man stood before Eleanor as if greeting an equal, and Olivia sensed the tension beside her, her fingers tightening gently around her clutch as she leaned closer, whispering, "Why is he talking to her like that?" But Daniel did not answer, because he did not know, and Alexander gestured subtly toward the quieter side of the ballroom, but Eleanor did not move immediately. Instead, she took a small sip of sparkling water, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if she understood the weight of eyes following her, and across the room, the silver-haired investor straightened fully, his posture shifting from casual guest to attentive observer, and another executive adjusted his tie, watching carefully, and the ripple of recognition continued, quiet but unmistakable, and Daniel realized something he had not expected. People were no longer focused on him. They were focused on her, and that realization unsettled him more than he cared to admit, because only minutes earlier he had been the center of attention, proudly introducing Olivia, celebrating his success, and now the gravity of the room had shifted without a single announcement, and Eleanor finally stepped beside Alexander. Their pace aligned naturally as they moved slightly toward the center, not hidden, not dramatic, simply present, in a nearby event. Coordinator paused, hesitating briefly before adjusting her tablet, as if reconsidering the evening schedule, and Daniel noticed that too, his expression tightening, because events did not change without reason, and Olivia followed his gaze, her confidence softening as uncertainty crept into her expression, while Eleanor listened quietly as Alexander spoke in a low voice. Their conversation brief, composed, and then Alexander gave a small nod, as if confirming something already decided, and he turned slightly toward the stage where the master of ceremonies stood waiting, and the master of ceremonies immediately straightened, receiving a subtle signal, and Daniel felt the unease deepen, because he had attended enough events to recognize the signs. Something unexpected was about to happen, and Eleanor remained calm, her gaze moving briefly across the room until it met Daniel's for the first time that evening, her expression neither cold nor warm, simply composed. And in that quiet second, Daniel realized she was not there by accident. She had walked into the room knowing exactly what would follow. And as the master of ceremonies lifted the microphone and the soft music lowered, the entire ballroom gradually turned toward the stage, unaware that the next words would change the direction of the night, and Eleanor Hayes stood quietly beside Alexander Whitmore, as if she had always belonged there. The soft music faded as the master of ceremonies stepped forward, his polished smile returning as he lifted the microphone, and the gentle murmur of conversation gradually dissolved into attentive silence, because the tone of the evening had shifted, and everyone felt it without needing an explanation. While Daniel Carter stood motionless beside Olivia, his attention fixed on Eleanor Hayes and Alexander Whitmore, uncertainty tightening his expression as he tried to understand how the evening had moved beyond his control, and Olivia adjusted her posture, her smile still present but no longer effortless, as she followed the direction of the room, her eyes lingering on Eleanor with growing curiosity, and the master of ceremonies cleared his throat lightly. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight at the Whitmore Foundation Annual Partnership Gala, his voice calm and confident, echoing softly across the ballroom, and servers paused along the walls. Guests turned fully toward the stage, and the chandeliers reflected warm light across attentive faces, while Eleanor remained composed beside Alexander, her hands relaxed, her expression calm, as if she had anticipated every second of this moment. And Daniel shifted slightly, his fingers tightening around his glass, because something about the atmosphere told him the evening was no longer about celebration, but revelation. And the master of ceremonies continued. Tonight, we celebrate new ventures, new partnerships, and the individuals who help shape the future of our foundation. He paused briefly, glancing toward Alexander, receiving a subtle nod, and then he continued. Every year, the Whitmore Foundation welcomes a new strategic partner to our leadership board, someone whose vision and work reflect innovation, resilience, and long-term impact. The room grew quieter, curiosity spreading among guests, and Daniel felt a faint unease settle deeper, because he had attended similar events before, and he knew such announcements rarely came without significance. While Olivia leaned slightly closer, whispering softly, "Do you think this is one of your investors?" And Daniel shook his head slowly, his eyes never leaving Eleanor, because the pieces were beginning to align in a way he did not expect. And across the room, the silver-haired investor straightened fully, anticipation visible in his expression, and another executive stepped slightly forward, adjusting his jacket as if preparing to greet someone important. And Eleanor took a slow breath, not nervous, not dramatic, simply grounded, her calm presence contrasting with the growing tension around her. And Alexander Whitmore folded his hands loosely in front of him, his expression composed, yet unmistakably proud. And Daniel noticed that detail, the subtle respect in Alexander's posture, and it unsettled him further, because he had spent years trying to earn that level of acknowledgement, and yet here it was, directed quietly toward the woman he once believed had faded from his world. And the master of ceremonies lifted the card in his hand, pausing for a moment that seemed longer than expected, allowing anticipation to settle fully across the ballroom. And then he spoke again, his voice steady. Tonight, we are honored to welcome someone whose work has already reshaped multiple initiatives within our foundation, someone whose leadership has quietly guided our most successful partnerships this year. Daniel's brow tightened, confusion deepening, while Olivia's smile slowly faded, and Eleanor remained still, her gaze calm, her presence unshaken, as if she had already accepted the outcome before the words were spoken. And the room leaned into the silence, waiting for the name that would shift everything. The silence stretched just long enough for anticipation to settle across the ballroom, and Daniel Carter felt his heartbeat slow as the master of ceremonies glanced once more toward Alexander Whitmore, then lowered his gaze to the card in his hand. This year's strategic partner has worked quietly behind the scenes, guiding projects that have already expanded our foundation's reach across 3 states and multiple community initiatives. The audience leaned forward slightly, curiosity deepening, and Olivia shifted her weight beside Daniel, her confidence softening as uncertainty replaced the earlier pride, while Eleanor Hayes remained still, her fingers resting lightly around the stem of her glass, her expression calm, as if the moment unfolding belonged to her, yet did not define her. and the master of ceremonies continued. Her leadership has been deliberate, thoughtful, and remarkably effective. And although many of you may not have realized it, several of the most successful collaborations this year were developed under her direction. Daniel felt a flicker of disbelief because he had followed those initiatives, had even attempted to connect with the leadership behind them. Yet the names had always remained private, and now the realization began forming slowly. While across the room, the silver-haired investor nodded quietly, recognition already settled in his expression. And Alexander Whitmore's posture remained composed, though there was unmistakable pride in the way he glanced briefly toward Eleanor, and the master of ceremonies lifted his head, allowing the pause to linger just long enough. "Please join me in welcoming our newest board partner," he said, his voice steady, and then he spoke the name clearly. "Eleanor Hayes." The words moved through the room like a quiet shift in gravity. Conversation stopped completely, and several guests exchanged stunned glances because the name carried more weight than they expected, and Daniel's fingers tightened around his glass as the realization settled fully. His expression still, his mind replaying every moment from earlier. That evening, the whisper, the recognition, Alexander's greeting, and now the confirmation. While Olivia's smile faded entirely, replaced by surprise she could not conceal, and Eleanor lowered her glass gently onto a nearby tray, her movements unhurried, composed, as if she had stepped into this moment long before the announcement. And as applause began, hesitant at first then gradually stronger, Eleanor stepped forward beside Alexander, her posture calm, her gaze steady, not seeking attention, yet receiving it naturally. And Daniel watched as several executives he had tried to impress turned toward her with genuine respect, their expressions shifting from curiosity to acknowledgement, and Alexander gestured lightly toward the stage, offering Eleanor the space beside him, and she moved forward, her steps measured, her presence quiet yet undeniable. And Daniel felt the distance between them widen in a way he had never expected, not physical, but something deeper, because the woman he once believed had faded into the past now stood at the center of the room, recognized not by history, but by achievement. And as Eleanor reached the stage and turned slightly toward the audience, the applause continued, steady and sincere, while Daniel Carter realized that the evening he had planned to celebrate his new beginning had quietly become the moment Eleanor Hayes stepped into a future far beyond him. Applause filled the ballroom, steady and respectful, as Eleanor Hayes stood beside Alexander Whitmore, her posture composed, her expression calm, and the warmth of the chandeliers reflected softly across her face. Yet she did not raise her hand dramatically or seek attention. She simply acknowledged the moment with a quiet nod, and the subtle restraint made the recognition feel even more powerful, because she did not appear surprised. She appeared prepared, and Daniel Carter watched from the crowd, his thoughts unsettled, as he noticed something he had not expected. The applause was not polite. It was genuine. Executives leaned forward slightly, investors exchanged approving glances, and several guests who had once greeted Daniel earlier now shifted their focus completely toward Eleanor, and Olivia remained beside him, her expression carefully composed, though her fingers tightened around her clutch as she followed the room's attention, trying to understand how the evening had transformed so quickly, while the master of ceremonies gestured gently toward Eleanor, inviting her to step closer, and she moved forward without hesitation, her steps measured, calm, her presence quiet yet commanding, and Alexander stepped slightly back, allowing her the space naturally, a gesture that did not go unnoticed, because those who understood the room recognized respect when they saw it. And Eleanor paused near the microphone, not immediately speaking, instead allowing the applause to fade on its own, her calm silence drawing even more attention. And when the room settled, she spoke softly, her voice steady and warm. "Thank you for the welcome," she said, her tone sincere, not overly formal. "The Whitmore Foundation has always focused on long-term impact, and I have been honored to work alongside a team that believes in building quietly and consistently." Her words were simple, yet the clarity in her voice reflected confidence earned over time, and Daniel felt the weight of that calm confidence more than any dramatic statement, because he remembered when she once spoke cautiously in rooms like this, choosing words carefully, but now her voice carried naturally, as if she belonged there without question. And Eleanor continued, "Many of the initiatives we launched this year began as small conversations, ideas shaped over early mornings and long evenings. And the results we see today belong to everyone who believed in those ideas before they became visible." She glanced briefly toward Alexander, acknowledging his support, and he inclined his head slightly, his expression proud yet reserved. And across the room, several investors nodded in agreement, recognizing the collaborative tone she carried. And Daniel realized something else. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply speaking from experience. And that authenticity resonated more deeply than any polished presentation. And Eleanor concluded gently, "I look forward to continuing this work and building something meaningful together." She stepped back slightly, allowing the applause to rise again, stronger this time. And as she moved away from the microphone, several guests near the front began preparing to approach her, their interest clear, and Daniel watched as the distance between his world and hers widened further, not because she had moved away, but because she had stepped forward into a space he had never expected her to reach. And as Eleanor returned beside Alexander Whitmore, their quiet exchange of acknowledgement reflected a partnership built long before this evening, leaving Daniel Carter standing in the crowd, realizing that the woman he once believed had disappeared from his life had instead been quietly building a future far beyond his understanding. The applause gradually softened into a warm murmur as guests began moving forward, one by one, their attention drawn naturally toward Eleanor Hayes. And the shift in energy was unmistakable, because where Daniel Carter had once stood surrounded by congratulations, the circle now formed around her. Investors approached with measured smiles. Executives extended their hands, and Eleanor greeted each of them with calm professionalism, her voice steady, her posture relaxed, as if this recognition had grown gradually rather than arriving all at once. And Daniel watched the movement carefully, his expression tightening as he recognized several faces, individuals he had spent months trying to impress, now speaking with Eleanor as though they had known her for years, while Olivia stood beside him, her earlier confidence fading into polite composure, her gaze following the flow of attention that no longer belonged to them. And Eleanor listened as a senior investor spoke quietly about one of the foundation's initiatives, her responses thoughtful and measured, and when she nodded, the investor smiled with clear respect, not the polite courtesy given to newcomers, but the acknowledgement reserved for someone whose decisions carried weight. And Daniel felt that distinction settle heavily in his chest, because he understood how long it usually took to earn that level of recognition, and yet Eleanor had stepped into it without effort, as if she had been building this presence long before he noticed. And Alexander Whitmore remained nearby, allowing Eleanor to lead the conversations, his quiet support reinforcing the partnership without overshadowing her. And the subtle balance between them spoke louder than any formal announcement, because it showed trust, and Daniel recognized that too. While Olivia shifted slightly, her voice soft, "You never told me she was involved with Whitmore." And Daniel answered quietly, "She was not. At least not when I knew her," his words trailing off as uncertainty deepened. And across the room, Eleanor finished another conversation and stepped aside, her gaze briefly scanning the ballroom. And for a moment her eyes met Daniel's again, calm, composed, neither distant nor inviting, simply acknowledging his presence without lingering. And that brief exchange unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because she did not appear affected by his reaction. She did not seem interested in proving anything. She simply continued forward, greeting another guest who approached with a warm handshake. And Daniel realized that she had not returned to challenge him. She had returned because she belonged in that room, and the distinction quietly shifted his understanding of everything. And Olivia followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful now, as if reassessing the evening, while the music resumed softly in the background. Yet the center of gravity remained near Eleanor, and several attendees adjusted their plans, conversations reorganizing around her presence. And Daniel stood still, feeling the distance between past and present widen further, not through words or conflict, but through quiet recognition. And as Eleanor spoke calmly with another executive, her confidence natural and unforced, Daniel Carter understood that the evening had moved beyond comparison, Because Eleanor Hayes was no longer part of his past. She had quietly become part of a future he was only beginning to understand. The conversations around Eleanor Hayes continued to grow, forming a quiet circle of respect that shifted the entire rhythm of the ballroom. And Daniel Carter realized that even the tone of laughter nearby had changed, softer, more attentive, as if everyone was suddenly more aware of who stood among them. While Eleanor listened carefully to a senior executive describing a new expansion project, her expression thoughtful, her posture relaxed, and when she offered a measured response, the executive nodded with visible appreciation, already treating her opinion as guidance rather than introduction, and Alexander Whitmore stood beside her with calm confidence, occasionally adding a quiet remark, yet always allowing Eleanor to lead, reinforcing the balance of their partnership without drawing attention away from her. And Daniel noticed the detail, because he understood how rare it was for someone like Alexander Whitmore to step back, and Olivia followed the exchange silently, her expression thoughtful now, the earlier pride replaced by a quiet reassessment. While the music resumed softly across the ballroom, and servers moved again with silver trays, but the center of gravity remained around Eleanor, and a board member approached with a warm smile, extending his hand. "Miss Hayes, I have been hoping to speak with you about the Midwest Initiative," and Eleanor greeted him calmly, her voice steady as she discussed timelines and partnerships, and Daniel felt a flicker of recognition because he had attempted to enter that same initiative months earlier, yet had never received a response, and now the conversation unfolded effortlessly in front of him, as if doors he had struggled to open were already part of Eleanor's world. And Olivia glanced toward him briefly, her voice soft. "She seems very respected," and Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on Eleanor. "Yes, she is," and the admission settled quietly between them, while across the room, the silver-haired investor approached Eleanor with a welcoming smile. "It is good to finally see you in person," he said, and Eleanor responded with a warm but composed nod. "I appreciate your support earlier this year." Their exchange brief but meaningful, and Daniel realized they had worked together long before tonight. Another layer of Eleanor's quiet progress, revealed without explanation. And as the conversations shifted again, Eleanor stepped slightly aside, allowing others to speak, her calm presence steady, her movements unhurried. And then, as if guided by the rhythm of the evening, she began walking gently toward the quieter side of the ballroom, and her path naturally brought her closer to where Daniel and Olivia stood, and several guests noticed, stepping subtly aside, creating space without intention, and Daniel felt his breath slow as she approached, not dramatic, not confrontational, simply composed. And when she reached a comfortable distance, Eleanor paused briefly, her eyes meeting Daniel's once more, calm and clear, and for a moment the noise of the ballroom softened again, as if the evening itself paused to acknowledge the quiet distance between past and present, and Daniel understood that this moment did not belong to confrontation, but to recognition, because Eleanor Hayes no longer needed to say anything for the difference between them to be unmistakably clear. Eleanor Hayes stood calmly a few feet from Daniel Carter, the soft glow of the chandelier reflecting across the polished marble between them, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the quiet carrying more weight than any words could, while Olivia shifted slightly beside Daniel, her posture composed but observant, sensing that this moment belonged to something deeper than polite introductions, and Eleanor offered a small, courteous nod, not distant, not warm, simply respectful, the kind of acknowledgement given to someone from another chapter, and Daniel returned the gesture slowly, his expression thoughtful, because he realized that the familiarity he once expected no longer existed, replaced by a calm distance shaped by time and quiet growth, and the music drifted gently through the ballroom again. Yet the space around them remained still, as if the evening itself allowed this final recognition to settle, and Alexander Whitmore approached with his usual composed stride, stopping beside Eleanor with a subtle glance that reflected both partnership and quiet understanding. And he spoke softly. "The board would like a few minutes before the next session," and Eleanor nodded, her voice calm. "Of course," and Daniel noticed the ease between them, the natural rhythm of their exchange, and it became clear that this was not a new connection, but one built gradually, strengthened through shared work and mutual respect, and Olivia watched quietly, her earlier confidence replaced by thoughtful composure, and Eleanor turned slightly, preparing to continue toward the smaller reception area, but before she stepped away, she met Daniel's eyes. One final time, her expression steady, without regret, without triumph, simply calm acceptance. And in that quiet second, Daniel understood something he had not expected. She was not there to revisit the past. She was already living beyond it. And Eleanor then moved forward beside Alexander, their steps aligned, as several guests naturally made space, their attention following her not out of curiosity now, but recognition, and Daniel remained where he stood, watching as conversations resumed. Around her, invitations extended, introductions made, and the room adjusted once more to her presence, while Olivia exhaled softly beside him, her voice gentle. "She seems different," and Daniel nodded slowly, his gaze still following Eleanor. "She is," he replied quietly, and as Eleanor reached the far side of the ballroom, she paused briefly near the tall windows overlooking the city lights, the skyline stretching beyond the glass, calm and steady, much like her presence, and Alexander spoke quietly beside her, and she responded with a faint, composed smile, and then they moved forward together, stepping naturally into conversations that awaited them, while Daniel Carter stood beneath the chandeliers, realizing that the evening he planned to celebrate his future had quietly revealed something far more meaningful. Because Eleanor Hayes had not returned to reclaim anything from the past. She had simply walked forward into a future she had built quietly on her own, and the room no longer whispered her name with surprise. It carried her name with respect. And as the music continued and the lights shimmered across the ballroom, Eleanor Hayes moved forward without looking back, her calm presence leaving behind a quiet truth that needed no words. She did not come to win anyone back. She had already won herself.